Empty Picture Frame by Louisa Baldwin. Read by Bethina. It was a wild day in September. An equinoctial gale had raged since dawn, shaking doors and windows and battering the walls of Eastwick Court. The orchards were strewed with bruised fruit, plucked by the rude hand of the wind. The gardens that yesterday, neat and trim, basked in autumn sunshine, today were littered with branches stripped from the trees and melancholy with uprooted flowers. The paths were cut into channels by torrents of rain that washed the loose sand on the grass, where, as the water subsided, it lay in red patches. At sunset there came a sudden lull. The gale fell to a whisper, and the rain ceased. But no flush of light overspread the great sky, no western glow shone on the sombre walls or reflected its red light on the rain-washed windows of the old house. Within doors it was too dark to read or work, and in the enforced idleness of twilight, Miss Swinford laid down her book and seated herself on a low chair by the fire. Catherine Swinford was alone in the great drawing-room. As she leaned forward with hands clasped in her lap, watching the bickering flames that played about the logs on the hearth, there was something pathetic as well as dignified in her appearance. The mistress of Eastwick Court was no longer young. Her thick hair was streaked with white, and sundry lines on her brow and about her clear grey eyes showed where time's finger had touched her and left its mark. Her features were large but finely formed, her expression firm and self-reliant. Miss Swinford had lived so long alone, the mistress of a large property and a law unto herself in her own domain, that she had acquired the somewhat imperious manner of one who exercises a benevolent tyranny, and had an unquestioned right to be obeyed. She was the only child and heiress of Sir John Swinford, who had been dead some 12 years, and she had lost her mother in infancy. No one could have supposed that Miss Swinford, like Queen Elizabeth, was destined to reign alone. She had had as many suitors as the Virgin Queen herself, and they might be classed in 3 orders. The first, and most numerous, was attracted by the estate to which the lady seemed but the necessary appendage. The second felt the charm of the heiress, and the still greater charm of her wealth, while the third order of suitor was represented by one man only, who loved Catherine for her own sake, and would have sought her for his wife if she had been penniless. No need to tell the story. Es ist ein altes Liedchen. The true love died long ago, and his fever-warm body lay buried in the hot sand of a tropical shore, and Catherine Swinford was still and would always remain Catherine Swinford. Perhaps as she sat by her lonely hearth in the gathering dusk, she was thinking of what might have been, of the strong arm she might have leaned on, of the children that might have called her mother. She sighed, and rising abruptly rang for lights. This will never do. I shall grow melancholy if I sit by myself in the twilight. It is peopled with ghosts, and with might-have-beens, the worst of all ghosts. I have been too much alone lately. I ought to keep up a succession of visitors. By the way, I wonder why I have not heard from Sir Piers Hammersley. It is 10 days since I wrote to him, inviting his daughter to come and stay with me. And an air of bright energy succeeded to her momentary depression, and when the lights were brought into the room, Miss Swinford was looking 10 years younger than she had done a short time before. Sir Piers Hammersley was a cousin of the late Sir John Swynford, and both descended from a common ancestor, Sir Miles Swynford, who lived at Eastwick Court in the time of Charles I. The Hammersleys were originally Swynfords, but Sir Miles' second son Adam had married an heiress in Cumberland, Anne Hammersley, on the condition that he should bear her name as well as share her fortune. When Adam went to live in the north, he took with him his sister Jocelyn, whose lover, Colonel Dacres, had been wounded fighting for his king, and died in her father's house, since when she had pined and drooped at Eastwick Court. Jocelyn was only 23 years old, and her family thought that absence from home and its tragic associations would restore her to health and cheerfulness. And in this hope she made what was then the long, wild journey out of Herefordshire into Cumberland. But no change of air or scene could arrest the decline into which she had fallen. Before the spring came, she was laid in the vault of the Hammersleys. Her sad story and the tradition of her beauty, confirmed by a portrait still preserved at Eastwick Court, had caused her to be remembered both by the Swynfords and Hammersleys, and the name of Jocelyn had not been allowed to die out in the family. The very reason why Miss Swynford had bestirred herself to write to her father's cousin, whom she had not seen since she was a girl, was that his only daughter was named Jocelyn. Her heart had warmed towards her unknown kinswoman in her loneliness, and she had written asking Sir Piers to allow his daughter to visit her at the house that was the birthplace of the original Jocelyn. The Hammersleys still lived in Cumberland, and Miss Swynford's letter must have reached its destination the day after it was posted, but she had received no answer to her friendly invitation. She was astonished and almost affronted by chilling silence where she had hoped to meet with a cordial response. My cousin Jocelyn is so much younger than I that perhaps she does not feel very eager about spending a few weeks alone with me, she argued with herself. But at least she should be wishful to see the home of her ancestors and the portrait of Jocelyn Swynford, whom she is fortunate if she resembles in personal appearance. Here Miss Swynford's soliloquy was cut short by an unexpected interruption. A sound of heavy wheels driving slowly up the avenue by which the house was approached from the high road, and the carriage, wagon, or whatever it was that could be so ponderous, came to a standstill at the front door. The storm must have cut the gravel up terribly, thought Miss Swynford. I never heard wheels sound so heavy in the avenue before. Who can be paying an afternoon call so late, just when I'm about to dress for dinner? And the heavy carriage drove slowly away. Immediately afterwards the drawing-room door was thrown open, and Bennet, the old butler, announced, "Miss Hammersley." Miss Swynford started with surprise and advanced to welcome a young and tall lady dressed in black, some 15 years her junior. She was of a mortal pallor of complexion, with dreamy brown eyes and fair hair, and bearing the most extraordinary resemblance to the portrait of Jocelyn Swynford. "My dear cousin, you have dropped upon me from the clouds. I have received no intimation that I should have the pleasure of seeing you today, or I would have driven to the station to meet you myself." And she kissed her young kinswoman's pale cheek. "How cold you are, my dear! Come and sit near the fire before you take off your cloak." And she led Jocelyn to a low chair, and she sat down by the flickering fire with her back to the lamp. "What sort of a journey have you had this stormy day? I'm afraid you had to change trains rather often between Cumberland and our little village station." Jocelyn Hammersley raised her eyes with a strange, uncomprehending gaze, as though she were listening to a language she did not understand, and instead of replying to her question merely said, "I have come a long way. I am very tired." You are not strong, my dear, I'm afraid. You look so pale and weary. It is a pity I cannot give you a little of my superfluous strength." And Miss Swinford smiled kindly on her young cousin. She could not take her eyes from the white oval face, with its high marble brow, large dark eyes and heavy eyelids, delicate nose and small mouth, with lips too pale for health. "It is astounding, perfectly astounding," at length she said. "Do you know that you are the living image of our common ancestress, Jocelyn Swinford? You are exactly like the Van Dyck portrait in the library. I must show it to you." "Oh, not tonight, not tonight," pleaded her cousin. "Very well, then, not tonight, but first thing in the morning. By candlelight it might startle you. It would be like looking at the reflection of your face in a mirror. But let me unfasten your cloak for you, my dear." For her guest was enveloped in a long black silk cloak, with a hood drawn over her fair curls, a quaint garment becoming her so well as to suggest the idea that the pale, silent lady was an artist in dress and studied effects very successfully. "Do not let me trouble you," she replied, throwing her hood back upon her shoulders. "My waiting woman will give the help I require." "Your waiting woman? Dear child, what an antiquated phrase! But I suppose odd words and expressions still linger in the wilds of Cumberland. Your maid, yes. I will ring for her, and I will show you to your room, where I am afraid the fire can hardly be lighted yet. It should have been burning all day if you had only done me the honour to announce your arrival beforehand." And Miss Swinford opened the drawing-room door, when to her amazement her guest, with unhesitating step as though she knew her way perfectly, turned towards the old part of the house that was full of empty rooms. "Not that way, my dear. You are going to the disused part of the building. That has not been inhabited since my grandfather's time, and belongs nowadays entirely to ghosts and rats. Let me lead you to our comfortable modern rooms, less historically interesting, but better suited to the requirements of a tired traveller like yourself." And her guest turned to follow her with an expression of disappointment on her pale face. "May I not see the old rooms?" "Certainly, I will show you everything, beginning with your own portrait, tomorrow morning. But here is your maid, and this is your room. As we dine in half an hour, I will leave you now to dress." And mistress and maid were left together. Miss Hammersley's maid was no less remarkable looking than her mistress, with the same extreme pallor, though here the resemblance ended, for the mistress was beautiful and the maid distinctly ugly. Her grey hair was drawn away from her dark, bony forehead under a close-fitting white cap. Her eyes were small and black, and her mouth large, with thin, compressed lips. Like her mistress, she was dressed in entire disregard of existing fashion, in a dark woolen material with a deep linen collar and long white apron. At first the sight of a maid wearing a cap that a modern cook would scorn, and an apron suitable in size for a scullion, occasioned rude mirth amongst Miss Swinford's servants, but their laughter was brief and succeeded by uneasy fear, for Mistress Galt, as Miss Hammersley called her maid, had queer, unaccountable ways in harmony with her strange and repellent appearance. The morning after Miss Hammersley's arrival at Eastwick Court, the sun shone brightly on the destruction caused by the storm of the previous day, and the gardeners were busy repairing the damage done by the wind and rain. When Miss Swinford entered the breakfast-room, her guest was walking on the terrace, dressed in a white, close-fitting gown, low and open at the front, and her bare neck exposed to the chilly morning air. Miss Swinford hastened to her from the open window, exclaiming, "My dear child, you will catch your death of cold. Come back and put a shawl over your neck. Is it still the fashion to come down to breakfast in a low dress, as my grandmother used to do?" and she led her into the house and wrapped a soft shawl about her shoulders. "How cold you are, and the morning air has brought no colour to your face. My dear child, are you always as cold as this?" "Yes, always," she replied quietly, then adding, as though speaking to herself, "Yet I am clothed in woolen and sheltered from wind and rain." "Drink your coffee. You make me cold to look at you. And after breakfast I will take you upstairs to the library to show you the portrait of your namesake, and you shall tell me if you see the resemblance to yourself which I think so striking. It is an odd coincidence. The dress you are wearing might have been copied from that in the picture, but you shall see for yourself." And Miss Swynford, pleased to have someone to talk to, continued chatting, and did not notice how silent her cousin remained. After breakfast she took Jocelyn's cold hand in hers and led her upstairs. "The library was my father's favourite room, and I have made no alteration in it since his time. It was there that I last saw your father, and I remember how greatly he admired Jocelyn Swynford's portrait. He said he should like to have a copy of it, but he does not need that as long as he has you to look at, my dear." And Miss Swynford flung the door of the library wide open with a triumphant "There!" But she started with astonishment, for over the fireplace, where the portrait of Jocelyn Swynford had been, hung only the empty frame, its tarnished gilding in sombre harmony with the square of blackened wall that had been covered by the canvas. Miss Swynford rang the bell impetuously and ran into the corridor to second its summons with her voice. "Bennet! Bennet! There is the most extraordinary thing! The old portrait of Miss Jocelyn Swynford has been taken out of the frame and carried away bodily. The house has been broken into during the night. Search everywhere and find out by what door or window it has been entered." The servants gathered in a cluster round the library door, looking up at the empty frame with awe-stricken faces, and Miss Swynford sat down and fairly burst into tears. Jocelyn gently laid her hand on her shoulder and said in a low voice, "Do not weep. The picture will be restored to you." And raising her eyes, her cousin beheld the very embodiment of Jocelyn Swynford's portrait standing beside her. The shawl had slipped from her shoulders, leaving her neck uncovered, and in face, attitude, and costume she was so amazingly like the figure in the missing picture that Miss Swynford started, and the servants, still peering in at the door, looked from the empty frame to the pale lady, and then at each other with indefinable fear. No trace of thieves could be discovered. No lock, bolt, or bar on door or window had been tampered with, and the picture was hung so high that whoever had stolen it must have accomplished the theft by the help of a ladder. The local superintendent of police came to examine the house and to take down a description of the missing picture from Miss Swynford's lips, and she advertised a large reward for its discovery or for such information as should lead to the detection of the thief. "The picture will be restored to you," repeated Jocelyn. "I'm afraid not, my dear. The stolen portrait of the beautiful Duchess of Devonshire has never been recovered, and how can I hope to get my picture back again and to unravel the mystery of its disappearance?" Miss Swynford telegraphed tidings of her loss to her lawyer in London and followed it up by a long letter of instructions. He was to send a description of the missing portrait to all the picture dealers, and an advertisement was put in the papers warning pawnbrokers to detain the bearer as well as the picture if it was offered to them. And having done everything in her power to recover her treasure, Miss Swynford remained inconsolable under her loss. The excitement in the servants' hall was intense, and the physical difficulty of abstracting from its frame a picture hung at such a height was dilated upon at great length. Finally, they all agreed with old Bennet, when he gave it as his opinion that it was like as if it had been spirited away. Only one person in the house appeared indifferent to the prevailing distress and anxiety, and this was Mistress Galt, who went about chuckling to herself with eldritch laughter. Several days passed in which Miss Swynford did little but lament her loss, and exhaust conjecture as to how the picture could have been so mysteriously removed, but neither search nor inquiry threw any light on the matter. The portrait had vanished, leaving no more trace than if it had melted into thin air. Her distraction of mind at first prevented Miss Swynford from noticing her guest, as she otherwise would have done. But as she became less preoccupied, she observed in Jocelyn Hammersley numberless little peculiarities that, taken altogether, convinced her she was unlike anyone she had ever met before. She had none of the ardour and impetuosity of youth. She was silent and reticent. She was ignorant of everyday matters that a child would know, and yet surprised by her considerable out-of-the-way knowledge and acquaintance with bygone times, though she knew nothing of contemporary history. Her phraseology was often amusingly antiquated. Sometimes, too, she would misunderstand the plainest language and require it to be translated into another form before she appeared to grasp its meaning. "Does your father never take you to London, my dear?" asked Miss Swynford, thinking it a pity that so lovely a creature should not see more society than her country home afforded. "He took me thither once on a time when I was but a child, and I called to mind that while we were at our lodging in Whitehall, the Queen was brought to bed of a son, and the rejoicing thereat." "My dear Jocelyn, you positively must not make use of such an old-fashioned, countrified expression as 'brought to bed,'" said Miss Swynford. "It is only fit for an old nurse. Ladies may have spoken in that way a century ago, but it is purely rustic now. If you must date your visit to London by royal domestic events, you should say you were there when the Queen was confined." "But that would not be the truth," replied Jocelyn, raising her dark eyes and folding her hands in her lap, "for it was not the Queen's, but the King's Majesty that was confined in Carisbrooke Castle." And she sighed heavily. Miss Swynford was confounded. Could it be that her beautiful young kinswoman was mildly deranged? She looked into the dreamy brown eyes fixed upon her, and merely saying, "I think you have lived too much alone in the country," lapsed into thoughtful silence. That night, when Miss Swynford was retiring to rest and her maid was about to leave the room, she lingered at the door and said, "There's something I want to speak to you about, miss, but I hardly know how to, for it's about Miss Hammersley." "What is it, Dapper? What can you have to say that concerns my cousin?" "There's something strange about the young lady, miss, and about Mistress Galt, too, as she calls her. They walk in their sleep, or something as bad. Last night, when I was lying awake, I heard of footsteps, and I got up and opened my door and crossed the gallery and looked over the banisters. And there below, if it wasn't Miss Hammersley and her maid going into the empty rooms in the old part of the house. I saw them quite plain in the moonlight through the big window. They were in their day dresses. They hadn't undressed for bed, though it was past 2 o'clock, and Miss Hammersley was crying and sobbing. They seemed to know their way about the house in the dark as well as we do by daylight. I felt frightened and went back to bed, and it would be a good half-hour before I heard them creep back to their rooms again. I thought I'd better tell you about this, miss." "You amaze me, Dapper. It's impossible that they both walk in their sleep. But perhaps my cousin does, and her maid follows her, lest she should meet with some accident, or wake suddenly and be alarmed. I hope, miss, that if you hear anything tonight, you'll please to get up and see for yourself. I'll put your dressing gown by the candle and matches, and if you want me, I'm a light sleeper, and I should wake if you only scratched on the door." And Dapper retired, leaving her mistress profoundly uneasy. Many uncomfortable thoughts were suggested to Miss Swinford's mind by what she had heard. She rose and locked the door, that if Jocelyn walked in her sleep, at all events she would not be startled by her entering the room in the night with wide, unseeing eyes. She thought over all her cousin's peculiarities, her strange, inanimate expression, her deadly pallor and coldness, her silence and dreamy look, and decided that she was very likely subject to be a somnambulist. Having settled this painful matter to her satisfaction, Miss Swinford's mind reverted to its favourite theme, the inexplicable loss of the portrait, and she fell asleep to dream that her cousin stood in the tarnished frame over the library mantel-shelf, saying, "I told you that Jocelyn Swinford's portrait would come back to you." When she woke suddenly, the clock struck 2, and she heard gentle steps in the carpeted gallery. In a moment she had put on her dressing gown and opened the door. Dapper had left a lamp burning, and by its light she saw Jocelyn Hammersley in the gallery on the opposite side of the hall, followed by her maid, walking towards the door leading to the old part of the house. Miss Swinford hastened along the gallery that ran round the 4 sides of the hall till she was close behind the dim figures that had now passed beyond the light of the lamp. Mistress Galt was silent and rigid, but Jocelyn, pale as death, walked with clasped hands, moaning to herself. They left the door open as they entered the deserted rooms, and Miss Swinford followed unperceived. They passed quickly across stretches of pallid moonlight falling through the dusty windows, alternating with breadth of blackest shadow, opening door after door till they came to a corner room looking out to the front and end of the house. Then they paused, and Jocelyn lifted up her face that no moonlight could bleach whiter, and cried, "It was here that he died. On this spot my love died. Here he lay till they bore him to his last resting place. But far from me, I lie alone in my narrow bed." And Miss Swinford, terrified and convinced that her cousin was either a mad woman or a somnambulist, turned and fled. She did not pause or look behind her till she had locked herself in her room, when she fell half fainting upon the bed. "My poor cousin is insane. She has heard the story of the death of Jocelyn Swinford's lover in this house, and has brooded over it till, with her peculiar temperament, it has turned her brain. And that strange woman Galt is her keeper. I see it all now. How shall I get rid of her? I shall become mad myself if we stay together much longer in this old house. How could she know the room in which Colonel Dacres died? I have not told her, and she has not been at Eastwick Court before. It is hateful. It is uncanny." And Miss Swinford shuddered. Presently she heard light footsteps once more, and opening the door saw the dim figures of her cousin and her maid returning to their room. They had made a complete circuit of the house and regained the gallery by means of a disused staircase, the door leading to which was kept locked. When all was once more silent, Miss Swinford crossed the gallery, candle in hand, to examine for herself if the lock had been tampered with. But the door was fastened as it had been for many years, and the paper pasted round it to prevent draughts was undisturbed. Yet there was no other means of reaching the side of the gallery by which Jocelyn Hammersley and Mistress Galt had returned to their rooms, except by this staircase. Miss Swinford slept no more that night, and when she closed her eyes it was only to open them and assure herself that the pale-faced Jocelyn was not standing by her side. At length, when morning light filled the room, she drew aside the curtain and looked into the garden. She was startled to see Jocelyn and Mistress Galt standing together under the window. Neither of them wore hood or kerchief in the keen morning air, and Jocelyn's bare neck looked white and cold as marble. "She is as like the old portrait as though she were the original Jocelyn come back from the dead," exclaimed Miss Swynford. Mistress and maid were looking fixedly at a spot in the garden, towards which first one pointed and then another, and in the silence of the early morning Miss Swynford could hear every word. "And I say, Mistress Jocelyn, that the bowling green lay yonder." "Nay, be not so confident. You were here but for a few months when all was sorrow and confusion, while I dwelt here for 23 years, until the cruel wars came, had great joy and pleasure in my home. The bowling green was by the sundial, and it lay to the north of the maze, but that is gone too. All is changed. The very flowers wear strange faces. Shall you not rest, mistress, since you have seen that which you prayed to see once more?" "Yes, I shall rest. I shall sleep till we all wake together." "Mad! Stark mad!" ejaculated her cousin as she dropped the curtain and turned from the window. The day proved wet and stormy, and Miss Swynford had to pass the heavy hours indoors with her uncanny guest. She was now so fully convinced of her cousin's insanity that she felt nervous in her presence and unable to question her about her mysterious conduct. Jocelyn was, if possible, quieter and more reserved than ever. She looked fearfully ill, at times scarcely conscious, as though her dark eyes moved with difficulty from one object to another. "I'm afraid you did not rest well last night. You seem so tired," Miss Swynford ventured to say. "I have not slept of late, but soon I shall rest again." And she seemed almost to fall asleep as she spoke. Only once did she show spontaneous interest in anything, when turning over the leaves of a book she came upon an engraving of the celebrated portrait of Strafford. Then her pale face seemed to radiate light. "My Lord Strafford!" she exclaimed, "and yet how unlike, for no picture can give the dark fire of his eye. O noble soul, that gave thy life for thy king, and yet wast powerless to avert his doom." At length the tedious day drew to an end. The two ladies were sitting in silence in the drawing-room, Miss Swynford wondering when her strange companion would depart. She was resolved that she would write to Sir Piers to say that the change back to the bracing air of the north would be beneficial to his daughter's health, when Jocelyn rose noiselessly and left the room. "How shall I get through another night with that unaccountable being wandering about the house, asleep or insane?" she thought, looking after her with troubled expression. "I cannot bear the strain of her company. It will be long indeed before I invite a stranger again to pay me a visit." When the door opened and her cousin stood before her, pale as a lily, dressed in her black travelling cloak and hood, Miss Swynford rose in amazement. "My dear, what is the meaning of this? You came unannounced. You cannot surely be leaving me as abruptly as you arrived." "I must go. I am wanted," she said, and as she spoke the sound of heavy wheels was heard approaching the house. An inexplicable fear fell upon Miss Swynford. "But how shall you travel? You are too late for any train tonight." "I go as I came. I shall soon be at my journey's end. Farewell, cousin Catherine, and be of good cheer. The portrait of Jocelyn Swynford will be restored to you." Miss Swynford mechanically followed her downstairs, where Mistress Galt was already waiting, and the servants peering over the banisters to watch the departure. Miss Swinford stepped into the porch with her guest, and there stood waiting a huge coach drawn by 4 black horses. By the light of the moon issuing from beneath a cloud, she saw that the coachman was dressed in as antique a style as his mistress, and that his face, like hers, was deadly pale. "Farewell, cousin, farewell," said Jocelyn, touching Miss Swinford's cheek with her cold lips. "The missing picture will be restored to its place." And followed by Mistress Galt, she stepped into the coach, in which 6 persons could have seated themselves with ease. She leaned out of the window and bowed to her hostess with solemn formality. Then the horses, moving at a heavy trot, drew the lumbering vehicle down the avenue towards the high road. Miss Swinford, Bennet, Dapper, and a couple of grooms, attracted by the extraordinary sound of the heavy carriage approaching the house, stood awestruck, watching it depart. Not one of them could have expressed his fear in words, and yet the terror each felt was the greater for being unspoken. The huge coach rumbled along the avenue when it turned into the high road, and still they could hear the heavy wagon-like sound of its wheels. "They have taken the turning to the left," cried Miss Swinford, the first to break the silence. "That great carriage and 4 horses can never cross the brook bridge. They should have turned to the right. See if you can overtake them before the road is too narrow for them to turn." And the grooms ran down a side path that was used as a shortcut to the road. The heavy sound of wheels grew duller and more distant, and suddenly ceased. "Thank goodness they are stopped in time. They will turn now," said Miss Swinford. But still no sound was heard. Presently the grooms came back, breathless with running, the younger of them looking ready to faint. "You stopped them in time, Landon, I hope?" asked Miss Swinford of the elder of the 2 men. Oh, Lord, ma'am, there's no coach, nor nothing to stop. As I'm a living sinner, there's nothing but a 3-mile stretch of road, clear as day in the moonlight, and not so much as a wheelbarrow on it, and neither man nor beast to be seen. That big coach and 4's clean gone, same as if it had sunk into the ground." "Come into the house, madam," said Dapper, supporting her mistress, for she staggered as though she would fall. "And thank God, however they're gone, those white-faced witches are out of this place at last." And sick with amazement, Miss Swinford suffered herself to be led indoors. When she had recovered herself, she said with her usual determination, "Dapper and Bennet, come with me into the library. I want you both." And they followed their mistress in silence. Miss Swinford paused for an instant on the threshold, then opening wide the door, all 3 entered the room. The lamp stood on the table, a cheerful fire burned on the hearth, everything was in its accustomed order, and Dapper and Bennet looked vaguely about them, wondering why they were wanted. But their mistress pointed to the wall above the mantel-shelf. From its tarnished frame, the portrait of Jocelyn Swinford looked down on them once more, as though it had never been missing from its place. Dapper screamed shrilly. Bennet gazed open-mouthed. Miss Swinford buried her face in her hands and said in a tremulous voice, "This is dreadful. What does it mean? What can it mean?" The next morning's post brought Miss Swinford a letter from Sir Piers Hammersley at Carlsbad, where he and his daughters were staying, apologising for her letter remaining so long unanswered, but it had been carelessly overlooked and only forwarded to him that day. He was exceedingly annoyed to think how uncourteous he must have appeared. Jocelyn, too, was as sorry as himself. She hoped that her cousin would renew her kind invitation some future time, to give her the pleasure of making her acquaintance and of visiting the old home of the family. Then the strange, beautiful girl who had come and gone so mysteriously whose visit had corresponded with the absence of the portrait of Jocelyn Swynford, was not her cousin after all. Who was she then? Or what was she? Miss Swynford believed that she knew who her strange guest had been, but she dared not express her conviction in words. Her friends would have thought her mad. She kept her secret locked in her breast. But she was a changed woman from that time forward, and within 12 months the last of the Swynfords was laid to rest in the family burial place. The old servants still tell the story of the pale lady's visit and her weird ways, and how their mistress fell into pining health from the very night of her mysterious departure. That was The Empty Picture Frame, from a collection of stories called The Shadow on the Blind by Mrs. Alfred Baldwin, published in 1895. Louisa Baldwin was the daughter of a Methodist minister. She was Rudyard Kipling's aunt and sister-in-law of the artists Edward Burne-Jones and Edward John Poynter. She was also the mother of the Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin. This is a haunted picture story, and I've read a couple more variations on this theme. I hope you enjoyed this one. If so, please remember to click the like button and have a look at my playlist of audiobooks for more ghost stories. I'd like to say a very special thank you to my channel members, Kathy, Insipis TV, Kenneth, Yet Bass and R. Simon. Your support is very much appreciated.